K-pop demon hunters Saja Boy's breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
I love the word ecosystem as much as everyone does, and I use it all the time. You know, an ecosystem is not a business model. You know, the sun is practically infinite, and you know, the amount of carbon dioxide that plants have to use to generate oxygen is practically infinite. You know, money does not grow on trees. Journalism is not, it relies on systems, it relies on networks. So let's not fool ourselves in thinking we can sort of recreate journalism again out of thin air.
This is Small Press, Big Idea, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gewertz. Small Press, Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Eric Larson. Eric is the CEO of the Org Detectives and also a managing partner of JHL Consultants. Did you want me to say that part? Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
Through it. And we had a great call last week. Decided to hop on a podcast and talk. Basically, have the same call again. So, Eric, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. Good to see you again.
My pleasure, Paul. And kudos. I've been trying to catch up on your archive of interviews. Always looking for good podcasts about the questions and the challenges facing the industry. And you've got a wonderful gallery of guests, present company excluded. I feel, a little out of place in that respect, but really enjoyed going back and hearing what a lot of your other guests have said.
The nice thing about the people in this kind of industry, local media, is everybody says that. Everybody is like present company excluded. I'm like, oh, everybody has the same mentality and everything. Yeah. But this should be a good one. So could you just set the stage and tell us a little bit about your background in local media industry and everything? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So boy, we're going into ancient history, but my parents were Midwesterners my dad moved a lot as he was climbing the ladder of engineering jobs. We found ourselves in Northwest Alabama when I was just a little kid. I was 5. We had moved 5 times before I was 5. So I kind of feel like one of those military brats, right? Moving around a lot. But we settled in Northwest Alabama, and that's where we stayed essentially through my schooling. I got introduced to a love of writing and even a love of interviewing early. I was doing interviews of new teachers for the 7th grade, Bear Facts, it was called. Just a little mimeographed newsletter that basically the 7th grade English teacher sponsored. So when I got to high school, got involved in journalism still. Again, I sort of combined this love of writing with this love of, talking to people or asking them questions. And I love that sort of season ticket to just sort of walk up to people, anyone, and ask them questions. But really, I think my goal was to be sort of a journalist in the Hemingway style, where it was more about, how could you express yourself in writing? And you had this publication that just let you do that every day. I think, so I worked at the college paper at Duke University where I was a student. And when I graduated in the, late spring of 1993, I went looking for a newspaper job. It was a recession. It wasn't nearly the recession we were going to get, a dozen years later, 15 years later. But it was, it was frustrating. There weren't a lot of jobs, but I just basically got on my 1988 Nissan Sentra, drove down to Tampa and kind of made my way up through the Southeast, really from Florida, Alabama to Mississippi. I got offered 3 jobs as it happened, and they were all very distinct. One was a weekly in a little suburb of Tampa called the Pinellas Park News. And the owners there were really adamant that I work for them. And one of their selling points was, hey, if you work for us, you'll qualify for food stamps. And I was,
Strong
okay, well,
pitch. Strong pitch.
there you go. And then I got offered a job at a little paper in the middle of a cotton field in Greenwood, Mississippi, called the Greenwood Commonwealth. And I'd worked on a cotton farm during the summers in college. So I felt very much at home there, but I would be their only reporter. And going up against the Greenwood paper was a paper in East Alabama called the Anniston Star. And they had a very robust newsroom, close to 10 reporters. And that's in addition to a features department and a large sports department. And then, of course, we had 2 Metro editors and an executive editor and a really good copy. So that's the job I took because I knew I was going to learn a lot from some veterans and also some other younger reporters like myself. So did that for a little while. And that's when I really learned, Paul, that journalism was, at least in my observation, was more 90% reporting and 10% writing, right? The reporters everyone looked up to, they got the scoop. They got the story. They got the quote. It wasn't what a wordsmith they are, and so I still fancied myself as a writer, a creative writer, maybe a novelist one day. So I said, well, newspapers, I need to try magazines. So I did. After a few years at the paper, I stayed in place. I wrote I did some stringing for Newsweek. They had a bureau out of Atlanta at the time. I was sort of hunting for stories in Alabama, Mississippi. So while I was doing that, which was pretty good money, I was starting to try to write for longer form for magazines. I ended up, just trying to pay the bills with some trade pubs and never really finding my footing as a magazine writer. And basically punted and went from there. So to make a long story not too much longer, moved into a more Marcom type stuff, grant writing for nonprofits, did the Peace Corps, learned how to actually we took a camcorder, learned how to shoot and edit video. That was pretty cool. I was married by then. And then, having kids and trying to make ends meet led more to sort of not back to journalism, because what we saw then in the early 2000s was this fast, quickening slide. And so I ended up actually started my own business at one point, did a lot of video, had a half a dozen employees. We were making it until the recession hit, sold that business to a newspaper actually in Western North Carolina. And then, found a way to a corporate job where I could do marketing, communications, and so on and so forth. Never thought I'd get back into business again, but I did get my MBA along the way there. And then at some point realized, I've had a really nice sort of broad career. So what do those people with range do? Well, often they consult. And so that's what I did about 3 years ago. I hung out a shingle as a consultant, and surprisingly to me, one of my first clients was the very newspaper company in Alabama I had worked for as a reporter 30 years earlier, almost exactly 30 years earlier. So that really the past 31 months until just a few weeks ago, I was head down on that project and getting a lot of insight, being kind of in the soup with a company that was very quickly trying to make up for lost time and at the same time looking for, innovations, mainly in operations, but also looking at, as I got more and more interested in innovations on the revenue side. And that's what I'm trying to do now is focus on how can I help more papers than the one, by looking closely at the revenue models that are out there and trying to find new ways to bring in dollars. Because I think there's a lot that companies can do to buy time and, tighten their operations, make good decisions in order to basically give themselves more runway so that we can figure out, okay, what is this AI thing doing to the industry now? As if the industry needed another disruption, right?
Right.
And so, we got to figure out what's going to happen there. And then ultimately the industry needs a new model or several new revenue models because it just can't run on fumes in the way it has.
That's excellent. Yeah, you say stuff like innovations on the revenue side. My nerd brain from this podcast wants to dive right into that immediately. But
Go for it. Yeah.
but I also wanted to it's kind of tie in with that. In our initial call, you had talked about maybe there's other ideas beyond this, but in terms of that kind of innovations on the revenue side, you and I talked about on our first call the idea of newspaper revisiting the ad agency model that a lot of folks tried and maybe didn't, but maybe now these new AI tools and other tools are streamlining it to make it a new possibility. Can you talk about that a little bit? Your thoughts on that and yeah.
Sure. So, I mentioned that it was natural, and a lot of newspaper folks do this. They make the segue at some point into communications and marketing. Some of them to PR. I never really got my feet wet in PR too much, but the idea that we're going back 20 years ago when newspaper were starting to really feel the hurt from the internet and the fact that retail was hollowing out locally, so a lot of their customers were going under or having to pivot in how they marketed and advertised. It was natural to look at, okay, what can we do on the marketing side in addition to selling some ads into our publications? And we've sort of seen the progression of audience, the fracturing of audience and how newspapers just don't command the audience that they did. I think it's not telling tales out of school to say, the company in Alabama I worked for, we were at their peak audience, especially, it was all print, but in 1990, and they were at a fraction of that until recently. So that's repeated everywhere. So you're not selling audience in the way you did. So your ad sales go down and sure, you can try to reclaim some of that online, but that's a very fractured audience online as well. So keep doing that, obviously. And you've interviewed some publishers who've had success building audience digitally. So keep doing that. But what else can you do to help local businesses? And the fact is, I felt it firsthand owning a business in a rural Western North Carolina market. You're scrambling as a business owner to find capital, to find clients, to get paid by those clients. It is a rat race, and there's not a single entrepreneur out there that knows how to do everything well. So when I was starting out in business, I was fortunate that I had a marketing background, and I was able to segue to being a salesperson for my company and know how to talk about my company and know where to go. Not every entrepreneur has that background. So it would be wonderful if they could turn to a resource to help them with the marketing piece. There are a lot of newspapers that tried the ad agency model 20, 15 years ago and gave it up. And there's a few reasons for that. It was hard to scale. You needed designers who were not cheap. They tended to use the Adobe suite, which came with a price tag, and they were highly skilled and they were artistes, and they took some time. So it took time, it took money, and newspapers just couldn't afford even if they could build the capacity to do the marketing, to do the branding piece, say, and the logoing. And then they also had to have the wherewithal to create marketing strategies and campaigns and all those things that go into sort of a marketing function. They struggled. Most abandoned it. There are a few companies out there. I know the Chattanooga Times has an agency in-house, and a few others do, but those are still often around the traditional models. And most companies can't afford, a $10,000 branding process, right? And whereas I value very much the expertise that goes into that work. And I understand why it takes so long. It's like you go to a fine Italian restaurant, it's going to take a little longer. It's not fast food, right? But the fact is, there's a lot of businesses that come and go in and out of business while the market tries to figure out how to deliver really good branding, for example, at scale. Well, now it can. That's at least the hypothesis my firm's running with. We're working with the AI tools to brand quickly. The experiment that we were running is, if I can spend an hour with a business and go through a questionnaire, mainly asking the questions around marketing, where they want to be, what they want to sell, how much they want to sell, who they sell to. If I'm really good at asking those questions, and I like to think as a former journalist I am, then we can work with the AI tools to build out what I call a marketing kit for the client very quickly. We can do that with the hour interview I just mentioned. We can take another 3 hours and build out we can build out a draft of a marketing strategy, personas of their most likely customers, campaigns aimed at those, voiced at those personas, rebrand them, color them, logo them, and do that in 3 hours and 4 hours total with the interview. And that's something that we think we can give away for free. And the reason why we want to do that with a customer, one, it takes as much time to try to persuade someone to give you their first dollar as it does to do what I just described.
Right.
So and you may never get them, but if you can learn something about their business fairly quickly, develop that rapport, deliver something of high value, and earn a measure of trust, and say, hey, we now want to be your marketing department. And if they'll say yes to that, and they'll pay a monthly retainer, and they also have a budget for ad spend that you can then help them spend on a new website, which you help them build with tools that are fast and amazing. If you can help them spend not just on newspaper ads, but on other forms of advertising. I mean, that is the ad agency model dream that was attempted again 15, 20 years ago and abandoned because it couldn't scale. I think that is a huge opportunity, and we're experimenting with that. We got our first client a few weeks ago. We've already stood up, did her branding, everything, stood up her website. She's delighted. This is someone who's been in business for 8 years with a home healthcare business here in Raleigh, and has really been disappointed over and over again with marketing vendors who did not deliver. She, not being savvy in that area, didn't always, maybe pick wisely. But I mean, again, this is where newspapers have a measure of trust already. They need to expand what they do for local businesses. And this is maybe thinking too far ahead, but you have to think ahead because everything's moving so quickly. If newspapers can solve the marketing problems for businesses, in the process, you learn about all the other problems they're having, and then it's a maybe not too far a leap to think about solving some of those other business problems around HR, around maybe systems and operations, IT, maybe around finance. That's a huge one. It's hard to find good accountants. There's not enough of them. And so, with newspapers having all these connections, I mean, think about the newsroom and all its sources, right, around the community. Newspapers having boots on the ground salespeople working with businesses for generations now. You think about the fact that in even a small town, some of the smartest people you ever met are working in newspaper. And why? Because they're really good at finding information, sorting through and analyzing that information, and then synthesizing that information into useful tools for people in the community. That's really, when you think about it, that's the work of a consultant too, a business consultant. And, again, I am not an expert on everything, and I wasn't when I was a journalist, but I was an expert at finding the experts. And really, that's what you have to do. You have to be nimble. You have to know, when do I go to an AI tool that can do this very quickly for a client? Where do I go to recruit an expert in this particular software and bring them on to help the client fix that problem? And that ability to very quickly assess, interview a business owner, if you will, and then figure out what do they need and be able to communicate that in all directions, so that you can go to a vendor and say, this is a problem the client has. Can you meet that need? And be that go-between, just as journalists have tended to be. I'm not pretending this is a snap your finger problem, but we've got, as an industry, we've got to think in these ways because, though I love the word ecosystem as much as everyone does, and I use it all the time, an ecosystem is not a business model.
Mhm.
The sun is practically infinite, and the amount of carbon dioxide that plants have to use to generate oxygen is practically infinite. You know, money does not grow on trees. Journalism is not, it relies on systems, it relies on networks. The analogy is there, but we've got to think in business terms, whether we like it or not, because that has always been the mutual dependency. That's what's made good journalism, deep, long form journalism, investigative writing has typically been a business model. There's been money behind it.
Mhm.
So let's not fool ourselves in thinking we can sort of recreate journalism again out of thin air. There has to be some money behind it. And it has to be money that's not viewed right out on the face of it as partisan. Because
Mhm.
right now, what you've got is people, choosing their own favorite outlet because they like what they hear. And then, I firmly believe we have to have institutions behind journalism. I think if it's just a lot of creators and bloggers, I think that can make for some really diverse, interesting, in many cases, very trustworthy journalism, right? I'm not saying it can't, but how do you signal trust in that kind of a landscape? It becomes very difficult. And then when people say, well, but we don't trust institutions that well anymore. To me, often it sounds like people saying, in Shakespearean terms, well, you know, people just don't trust Desdemona like they used to. And, what can Desdemona do to earn trust again? Well, one, we can't be a bunch of Othellos so gullible believing this and that. We've got to call out the Iagos who are essentially sowing distrust so that they'll get attention. And if you really look at what we're dealing with here, we got to have when the shit hits the fan, people are going to go to institutions that they trust as a touchstone on what's true. And the institutions are the ones with all the overhead. They're the ones financing the full-time news gatherers, the camera people that are all over the world recording what's real. And that's even the pundits don't acknowledge how much they rely on that.
Mm.
You can spin all day long, but if people don't agree that what's happening on the ground in Ukraine or Iran, well, then you're having endless arguments about whether there's been a peace treaty signed. Well, I saw that on the internet. One more story, and then I'll let you get in another question, Paul. But I was at a conference in Memphis it was the press associations collaborating from Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And that was back last summer. And someone told the story of being the first on the ground as a reporter on a small plane crash. And like they had the scanner, just like old time journalism, and they just happened to get there before everyone else. And while he was on the scene, he got a call from his newsroom, and the editor there said, "Hey, I just saw on Facebook that there's been a plane crash and 3 people died." And he's looking around at bodies, and he said, "No, it's 4 people died." And they say, "No, no, no, no. It's right here on
Jeez.
Facebook. 3 people died." Okay, that's maybe a fine point, but you can already see where there's going to be arguments about whether something is AI generated, something is generated by someone with their phone and maybe not presented in the most truthful context, or it's something that the mainstream press. There's 4 of them there from Reuters and AP and CNN and whatever, and they're together understanding what's going on. To me, it's pretty easy who you believe there. But once that infrastructure goes away, then it's anybody's guess as to what's true at any given time. And my kids' generation is probably the first generation that when they go to the web to find out what happened, there is no compass.
Yep.
It is absolutely anyone's guess. And at some point, what are they going to believe? And honestly, businesses need certainty so they can make decisions. People need certainty so they know who to vote for or not, or whether to riot or not. And we've got to bolster, to me, the institutional gathering of news for those reasons.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Yep. Yeah, that story is a great, I'll have to clip that out. It's a great example of what happens when there's not solid local or any information. Somebody in the newsroom is like, no, it's right here on Facebook. Anyway, and also just what you were saying about the agency model. I think it's a great timing for that kind of conversation too, where this is a great idea. A lot of people thought about it 15 years ago, but you need that artiste designer and a developer and expertise in all these areas, and all of that is just getting slashed away. That's like the huge benefit of AI and everything, of enabling these kind of things to happen. In terms of that, outside of kind of that marketing agency model, I wonder if just your years in the biz or with the org detectives, or you're just consulting, what other revenue opportunities are there that would you be going after if you were consulting with a local newspaper, whether it's new and enabled by AI or something obvious that's been sitting there that people aren't taking advantage of? Because once again, I like to nerd out on that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I wish, you read about Warren Buffett, and, he's like made his fortune finding, I think he went to like dog tracks where people, threw away their winning tickets because they only won like 50 cents or something like that. And they would throw away, winnings, and he would just collect it and take it and aggregate that and make a lot of money. I think there are lots of those, probably. I mean, you hear about them on your podcast. People have found a way to get a little bit of money doing this, and a little bit of money, and a little bit here and there adds up to quite a lot. In terms of game changers, I mean, I'm most curious about the sort of business services angle that I just described, mainly because it's kind of what I do and what I've done. I mean, I've tried a lot of things that didn't work, back around when just before YouTube got big, and I was into video. An investor I met, an angel investor, said, hey, let's try this thing where we sort of try to aggregate video from communities and then share that video between different geographies. And then, we've got sort of a sharing. And it got to the point where I was like talking to companies, startups mainly, that were good at sharing very large video data files. And of course, that was YouTube solved a lot of that. Those problems that I was trying to solve and never really solved at the time. So, if you wait long enough, technology might present you with an opportunity. I mean, you see right now, people are like, who have really good English language skills, are being recruited to some extent by companies to work with AI and be able to be sort of the best prompters of AI, right? I mean, and I think journalists are, as I said earlier, really good at analyzing and synthesizing data, and they're good at asking those questions and synthesizing those prompts. So maybe they could do more of that for business. Put your newsroom to work in that unique way. I think something you and I talked about last time, I'm interested in looking more into, is what has technology allowed possible more recently in terms of micropayments, and how much money are we leaving on the table as an industry by not being able to allow customers to make purchases in the way they want to make purchases. I don't really want to spend $5 for a day with this one publication online. I'd like to maybe pay 50 cents for an article, but I don't want to pay 10 times that today. And then I'd like to go to 12 other newspapers and buy, 12 other articles for a reasonable price, and not have to buy a full-fledged subscription for either of those. And because the customer is faced with that dilemma. Newspapers are all the more tempted to put things in front of the paywall because they're like, we have to get traffic. We have to get people reading our stuff or we can't sell the advertising. So, and one of your guests talked about, the push-pull between advertising dollars and subscription dollars. So there's all kinds of, I am interested in that space, but you got to understand, I'm just coming up for air fall after working with this paper in Alabama. And I know you'd had a question about that too, around the people factor. Do you still want to talk about that?
Yeah. What I had written down, just to frame it up, it was another topic we talked about in our initial call, was the people challenge, I guess, is how I framed it, inside legacy news organizations.
Yeah.
Kind of what do you mean about that? What does that mean to you? And why does it matter for innovation? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I hear, I talked to publishers. I was at a conference recently and I asked questions of different publishers, what keeps you up at night? One of the big things is recruiting people with newspaper experience and being able to pay them a rate to keep them, right? If we can't afford a full-time general manager, how do we afford let's say a fractional GM? And I think there's more than one way to solve that recruitment people issue. I think let me zoom out a little bit and maybe try to answer that piece. For generations, newspapers were a cash cow. And as a result, your staff and your staff culture was one built very much around the status quo, getting the product out every day back when most papers were a daily, maybe even in some cases 2 editions in a day. And so you really hired for, folks who can do the technical aspect of newspapers, and they were reliable. They were there every day because you needed them every day. And I call these folks the maintainers, and every business needs maintainers. But newspapers were very heavy with maintainers because they were a daily product, right? They had so much routine. The systems were built around being able to replicate every day. So what happened when the industry became from a cash cow industry to an industry on the decline that required much in the way of innovation to reinvent, did have, of course, a lot of layoffs, but a lot of legacy folks stuck around, mainly because they knew how to push the right buttons. And that was, of course, in the context of a print product. A lot of those folks stuck around and are still there. Obviously, it would be wrong to say that if one is older, one cannot innovate. I would be a hypocrite. Just turned 55. So I like to think I can do new things. But what happened was publishers were then saying, we got to pivot to digital. We got to go fast. And you had a lot of folks that if they didn't outright say no, they would pay some lip service or some, and they would get in the fast lane, but they would go 10 miles an hour in the fast lane. And maybe the publisher cajoled them, bribed them, whatever, scared them into going twice as fast. And the publisher's like, well, I got my folks going twice as fast. Well, they're still going 20 miles an hour. And so at some point, you've got to find a way to bring up through your ranks, if they're already there, or from the outside, folks who are willing to go 65 in a 65 zone. And when you do that, I mean, I experienced this in Alabama when you had the right people in the room. Boy, you could go so fast, and it was electric, and it was exciting to be on a change project, to stand up a new glossy or a series of topical e-newsletters. And if you had the right people in the room, it was awesome. And a lot of publishers, I don't think they've experienced that. And so what they see as sort of loping along or going in spurts feels like, the best of all possible worlds, and it's not. And I think at some point you got to realize some folks that were built for a cash cow environment are not what you need for an innovation culture. And you've got to help them find a better place. Once you've given them a chance, plenty of opportunity, you help them find a better place where they can be successful in something, maybe with another cash cow type industry where their talents and where their temperament is honored every day. and bring in some folks, even if they don't know the business and the technical parts of newspaper. They're fast learners. Now with software, this stuff is not the rocket science maybe it used to be. There's a lot of user-friendly software out there. So let's adapt for the new. Why are we always playing standing up last year's play in front of this year's set? I mean, we got to change the script. And it's way past due for a lot of organizations that are running out of working capital to be able to make these innovation investments. So stop, throwing bad money after good, and try something new with people that are really eager to do the new thinking and the new ideas.
Yeah, it's well said. It's not something I've talked much about on this podcast, folks, and it's uncomfortable probably for some people, but it's a reality too. You know what I mean? It's just that the game has changed, and it's a very real thing, and it's hard. A lot of journalists, people in newsrooms are very mission driven, and they're good people, but it's just not going to keep working like that. You know what I mean? So well said on that front. I've been asking everybody this question. It's kind of a big one, but I'd love to get your take on it because I like the way you think about this stuff. Looking ahead 5 years, and it's kind of hard because things are changing so fast, especially like right now. What does a successful local news organization look like to you in 2031, I guess, now, 5 years? Yeah.
One, I think they've done a good job over the next 5 years of establishing continuity and trust. So having a team that gets really good at putting out the information every day that their local audience really needs. And that means listening to your local market. And I've heard your guests talk about this. I just heard an interview with someone, a VP at Hearst, talking about this, which is what is it that people come to depend on you for, whether it's local sports, prep sports, college sports, whether it's, new restaurants, new businesses, so that information piece still needs to be there because again, when the shit hits the fan, where do you go to know what's real? And so news organizations need to be there. And I think they need to be there with the legacy brands that even if younger people, haven't been subscribers, their parents are listen to a pronouncement from the local paper, because then the young, the next generation sort of sees that and it's signaled, okay, this is real. This isn't just something a pundit in a Yago out there puts out to just get attention and audience. So I think it's doubling down on local brand. I think it's very much embracing digital for real, finally, once and for all, and being the best at it in the community. If you think your team is just sort of, always a day late and a dollar short on digital, that's not going to win. You've got to be the leader in the organization. And you could say, well, I can't, I have trouble recruiting the smartest kids from the local college who they all want to go to Silicon Valley or they want to go to Raleigh-Durham metro area or whatever. I would say, okay, by and large, you may lose that fight, but you don't need hundreds of people, right? You just need a few who are excited to be part of a mission, who want to live in a smaller town, let's say, who like the pace of life, like that they can breathe the air, don't want to be stuck in traffic like in an Austin or a DC or an Atlanta or quickly Raleigh, they or not to mention New York City and so on. Yeah. But they want to be where they already live. They want to make a difference. They want to be part of a winning team, a culture of camaraderie and collaboration. They want to save journalism. So there are such people, and they're they don't want to go work for McKinsey. They don't want to go be a number at one of these big corporations. They want to be part of a team winning and saving democracy. So those people out there, I think smaller organizations will want to win in that way. And that's what's going to, because they're the voices every day with the weather, the news, the local stories. Maybe they're good at telling those stories in a TikTok vertical video format. By the way, that's another area I'm especially interested in. Having the video background that I did, such as it is, I am interested to see how newspapers might finally make the push to multimedia, especially video. In fact, when I sold my video production company to Jonathan Key at the Mountaineer in Waynesville, North Carolina, he was experimenting in that way, and it didn't work then. And he said, I saw him a few months ago and said, I'm sorry that did not work out for you, Jonathan. He said, Eric, I'm always trying new things. It didn't work then, but other things have worked. And so he's a very smart businessman and being willing to experiment. But I would love to see that direction because let's face it, the news stations, the broadcast stations, they know video very well, and they've figured out the web pretty darn well. So if newspapers, they have to be able to compete in those terms. So figure out digital, figure out video, figure out how to use AI in a way that helps, not confuses, and doesn't muddle things, and certainly doesn't hallucinate, in print or online for you. So, there's all kinds of things that need to happen. I don't know that I mentioned anything new there. If I could find an organization tomorrow that wants to work with my firm to find a new business model, I think that's the way newspapers are going to actually thrive into the next generation, and that is to find a way to not only pay the bills barely, but to have some room for error so that they can try new things. They have capital to do R&D, and that's where we start to see journalism winning again, and being able to keep a foot in the door before no one can trust what they read or see online.
Right. Well said. Good stuff. You're like a clip machine. There's like 4 things in there. I'm like, I need to turn that into a clip. Can you turn that into a clip?
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Where can people find you online or learn more about your work? If somebody wants to work with you, what should I link to and everything and promote?
Sure. I don't have a huge footprint online, but you can find me through theorgdetectives.com. You can get to the newspaper section of the website pretty easy. There's a button in the top right corner of the home page. And when you go to the newspapers page, click the first button there, which is read our case study. So you'll be taken to the Anniston, Alabama turnaround case study. In there, you can click and see lots of testimonials from the ownership and staff there in Alabama. Listen to them. Don't listen to me. How do they think we did? And I would love to help more publishers, own more of their destiny by getting control of some of their costs and creating new products, and that we can advise on that. And then if there's an organization that wants to really work on the business model piece, that's what I probably enjoy the most, Paul, is I enjoy being helpful in any way I can, but I enjoy being inventive. And I think especially when someone gets to be middle-aged like me, we got to lean into what we're best at, and what we enjoy the most. So let's invent together is what I would say to folks in the world and who want to make a difference.
Let's invent together. I love it. I love your mindset on all this stuff. That's why I love this podcast. I get pumped up when I hear people thinking and talking about stuff like this. Eric, thanks so much, man. Thanks for being here. And just have a great day.
You too, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.